I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is
Synthesis and Sophistry. Okay.
All right.
So, on today's episode of the podcast, we are talking about Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, and we'll be splashing in some Martin Luther King while we're at it. Both are kind of talking about moral and immoral laws and when a government is right to enforce them and when we are in the right to break them.
Yeah, I mean, they're both connected insofar as the reason that Thoreau takes umbrage with the American government is that it is a government wherein slavery is still legal.
Yes.
And on that basis, he's arguing that, Americans shouldn't pay their taxes because it's basically a criminal state and you shouldn't pay taxes to a criminal state.
Yeah.
That's the punchline of the article. But along the way, I think he brings up some useful themes for today. I mean, obviously, here in Canada today, happily, slavery is not legal. But we might use the principles for civil disobedience that Thoreau lays out to help us conceptualize a morally responsible reaction to other kinds of unjust laws that might come down the pike.
Yeah. And for Thoreau, unjust laws, how does he define unjust laws?
Right.
Because I think him and Martin Luther are a little bit different on that, but same sort of energy.
Yeah, so on page 516 of the reading, right, he gives us a sort of tripartite choice to make, right? If we are faced with an unjust law, we have three options. The first is to obey that unjust law, in which case we have dirty hands, right? We are morally culpable if we cooperate with injustice. We can obey temporarily until a legal amendment is possible, which again leaves us with dirty hands, but maybe slightly less dirty. Or we can disobey immediately. And so he says this is the best solution to the problem of an unjust law, and that we should be willing to be imprisoned as a consequence of our resisting a government which forces us to live by an unjust policy. So he has some interesting quotes about this. This is on page 518. He writes, "Prison is the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor," which is a great quote, I think. Many people have, for very good reasons, an inherent fear of going to jail, but Thoreau, he portrays it as if it's no big deal. Yeah. As long as you're right with your conscience, the inconvenience of imprisonment should not be feared as the worst thing ever.
Yeah. He also kind of made me chuckle a bit. In all his writings, he has that sort of old pioneering thing where he's like, oh, if the government comes after you, well, just grow your own crops and all these these sort of things. But nowadays, I'm not sure if that's as possible as it once was.
Yeah. Once again, like it's a philosophy from a different time. It has a sort of a more idyllic picture, I think, of what a person can do with the abundance of nature at their disposal. Less of that going on these days, as the frontier of civilization pushes further and further into nature. Less of these free, wild places where you can grow your own crops and avoid incarceration.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing that both essays have in common. And the feeling that I get reading from some political philosophy sometimes, both of them, they kind of call out the people who may theorize about things but not actually take any sort of action. He says, it's the quote where he talks about standing on another man's shoulders while he's drowning so that you can do your work. And Martin Luther King as well, on page 526, calls out the white moderate. And I think these are both kind of categorizing the same phenomenon. Martin Luther says, the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of attention, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. So yeah, I think in reading both these essays, it kind of gives you that sort of lights a fire under your butt to take action. It being neutral is not a moral option in this.
Right. There's two different kinds of lines on this that I've heard. One from career philosophers who want to perhaps defend their political inaction. And the line I've heard from them on this is that if your wheelhouse is producing theory, and if you are best served and best used by a cause, producing theory for that cause, then that should be what you specialize in, and that you shouldn't waste your time going to protests or putting yourself at risk of arrest, because that's not in the interests of the good work that you're doing, intellectually criticizing the cause. I think obviously Thoreau and Martin Luther King, what they're doing here is they're saying that's not enough. That's still hypocritical, right? And the more that you pontificate and sort of prolong the struggle, the more people suffer. And you are called upon at a certain point to act on your convictions, not just embroider them on doily cushions or hand out pamphlets in front of the SkyTrain.
Yeah. And I guess my response to that is like, well, you can do both, right? I mean, it's not like your time is so limited that you can't do both. And yeah, maybe you devote one more than the other.
Well, I mean, he's even so, for example, to go back to Thoreau, right, on page 516, he writes there that, we don't have any duty to take on supererogatory moral actions, right? We don't need to be moral saints. We don't all need to jump into the path of greatest resistance and make ourselves martyrs, but we do have a duty to wash our hands of truly evil acts. And according to him, we have no duty, therefore, to support a government that supports unjust policies like slavery or prosecutes unjust wars for the purposes of, enlarging its powers.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction. Like, you can't just go out and fight every battle. That seems not productive to a good life or to the causes you really care about.
Let me ask you a question. All right. So an anarchist is someone who believes that the absence of government will make people better moral agents. Right. So the problem now is that with these laws in place, they guide our actions to the point that we become lazy, we become morally atrophied, and we become worse people in a society that's bound by a government than a society that's not. That's the anarchist position, right? Now, you can buy it or not. I'm not asking you to debate whether you think that's true or not, but do you think that Thoreau with what he says in this article on civil disobedience, do you think he fits the mold of the anarchist, and if so, why?
Yeah, I kind of thought that he was. I don't know if anarchism was a movement back then, but maybe proto-anarchist. Because
right. That's the question, right? So if a figure predates a movement, I think it's still all right to go back and apply the label to them, right? So, before Sartre, we can still identify existentialists, even though that wasn't the term that they were writing, right? So some people sort of get labeled existentialists after the fact, and I'm sure that the same with anarchism can apply. So
I mean, the way you laid it out, I have a quote here on the bottom of page 514 that I think supports that reading of Thoreau. He says, "It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right. It is truly enough said that a corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men is a corporation with a conscience. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice." So yeah, I do think that he thinks having these sort of structures and laws do make you a worse person morally, and I do take a bit of objection from this, or I do take a bit of an objection to this, because I think that laws help shape our behavior and keep us from doing the worst sort of things. So having
like moral training wheels.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, that's how I kind of think about it. It can't do the work for you, but at least as you grow up and develop, before you start thinking about the world more broadly, it kind of gives you guidelines on how to act so that you're staying away from the worst kinds of behavior. It can't tell you how to be moral, but it can help shape you morally, if that makes sense.
Well, let me ask you some questions then. If you are truly immoral and you want to do wicked things, is any law going to stop you?
Yeah, no.
So I think that maybe defeats, or at least maybe makes us question the training wheels model.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking more generally, though. I think for most people, right?
The rule, not the exception.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I think for sociopaths or psychopaths, yeah, the laws aren't going to matter to them. I mean...
Why are you looking at me like that when you say that? Makes me uncomfortable.
You know why.
Well, I thought my first read of this article made me think, like yourself, that Thoreau was an anarchist, right? Right from the first line, when he says, "I heartily accept the motto, the government is best which governs least," right? And so to a disappearing point, right, where the best government is no government at all.
Yeah.
Right, so that disappearing point is anarchism. Then I think he backs up on that position, and he says, for example, once again on page 514, he says, "I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government." So he seems to say that, he doesn't want to abolish the state. He's not, that kind of radical anarchist. He thinks that, this is my interpretation of his position, is that the state should have room for people who have moral convictions to the contrary of state policies. The state should give them a chance to express themselves and tolerate them and learn from them and possibly modify its policies in light of their advice. So it's a kind of moral exceptionalism. To a point that he says, so on page 517, Thoreau writes, "Any man more right than his neighbors constitutes a majority of one already." Mm-hmm. So he abandons democratic principles if the masses have accidentally led us into supporting a law that is not morally supportable. right?
Yeah.
So an immoral law that we have good personal reason, good moral reasons to reject. He thinks that if you have the moral majority, even if you don't have the bulk of the numbers.
Yeah. That seemed like an odd line to me. The moral majority, I don't understand that. I guess just like you got a
veto power, right? I think is what he means. It's like you can veto anything.
Yeah.
If it feels wrong, it's wrong.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Right. So maybe everybody in town wants to lynch Bob.
Yeah.
And if in your heart you're like, it's not right that we lynch Bob,
even
if everybody voted to do it at the town hall, you might, according to Thoreau, have a very strong and compelling reason to resist the will of the masses.
Yeah. And that's kind of his main point, right? That we shouldn't be compelled to follow laws that go against our moral intuitions.
Yeah. Conscience, I guess, is his word for it.
Yeah. I guess just to go back to your line when he says, I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. I interpreted it as him saying, I ask not that the government be abolished at once, but in the circumstances of there being a government right now, a better government, but maybe no government is. It just seems more consistent that the ideal for him is having no government in this sort of anarchist guise.
Well, I mean, so the quote on page 514, which sort of connects to this, is the idea that we should be men first and subjects afterwards. That seems to be the sort of proposal he's making.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say we should never be subjects. He does seem to say, against your training wheels model of the law, Thoreau says law never made man a whit more just. And respect for the law creates agents of injustice. Yeah. Right. In the case of people who are still paying taxes to a state that supports slavery. So, he does disdain, the structure that at least supports unjust laws. I don't know if he'd feel the same way. I don't know if he would if America had gone the abolitionist route by then and dropped the slave law. Yeah,
I guess. I would think that he would take a less extreme stance, I guess, or radical stance.
I mean, so I can speak further to this, right? Mm-hmm. So on page 518, right, he talks about, say, getting rid of the government. The cure might be worse than the disease, right? So if you don't support the government, abolishing it entirely could put your private property at risk, right? So if you give up the protection of the police and the military and social services, your life becomes crappier, right? That's Thomas Hobbes's state of nature argument, basically. And he says, therefore, right, we are torn between living with integrity and honesty as opposed to living a life of functionality and comfort. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to be dipped into radical discomfort, right? So if you're in a nation that is unable to defend itself against foreign invaders, or a nation that's tearing itself up with civil war, you're losing a lot of functionality. You can have all the integrity in the world. You can live honestly. But if you're on the run and your family's being slaughtered and everything you own is on fire, you might wish that you just paid your damn taxes. I don't know. I mean, there's a real pulling apart here, right, between theory and practice. It seems. Mm-hmm.
I think this kind of gets at the sort of contradiction that's always there between the individual and the society, right? Where everyone at some level kind of thinks that's great for everyone else, but not for me, for certain things. And I think that's kind of what that brings out.
Yes, I'm happy for you to go to prison for your beliefs, and I support you. I'll send you some postcards. in jail. And I think that's where Thoreau says, for every one virtuous person, you have 99 subscribers of virtue. Right? Or I suppose in our days, they'd be likes on a post. Right? One person posts something brave, 99 people, flock to love it or like it.
Yeah. I guess one problem with Thoreau, though, because that I do think he makes a very good point on the laws around slavery. I'm in complete agreement with him.
A bold stance.
Yep, as I'm known for. But when he's kind of talking about our conscience and how we shouldn't follow laws that go against our conscience, that does lean more into subjective territory. And at what level do we decide which laws to obey and which levels do we not? If everyone thinks different things about that, laws really lose their value pretty quickly.
You'll be subject to imprisonment, presumably. That's the cost of acting in line with your conscience. I think that maybe you're right with regard to murder, right? Like if we all have our own ideas about the law against murder, maybe we shouldn't just act on those willy-nilly, right? I don't know what's wrong with murder. I don't see anything wrong with it. So someone might say, right, in this hypothetical scenario you're describing, but here he's talking about a law supporting something that is obviously morally abhorrent. And that's why he says that, a lot of people with, good moral compasses, people with good consciences, if they're all put into prison, the government will be forced to capitulate and get rid of the law. If only villainous people who benefit from the unjust law are left in society, the government will be forced to repeal the law and free the conscientious objectors. But it might need to get to a sort of like a rather large tipping point. We might need to choke the jails with our bodies. Yeah. Right. And that is nonviolent protest, right? Yeah. So that gets us kind of over to King a little bit. So Thoreau is saying that, we should use the non-payment of taxes to fight back against unjust laws, and that is the paradigm of nonviolent resistance. And it hits them where it counts, right? Because he says, if you write a letter or make a personal petition to a politician, there's no guarantee they'll listen to you. But if you stop paying them, well, they notice that. Yeah. Won't they? Yeah. Right. And he says, this leads to one of Thoreau's more memorable quotes. Just before we switch over to consider King briefly, he writes on page 520, "I do not care to trace the course of my dollar, if I could, till it buys a man or a musket to shoot one with. The dollar is innocent, but I am concerned to trace the effects of my allegiance." So, in this case, you show allegiance by paying your taxes, and the dollars fall where they may, so to speak. You don't get to trace exactly how that money is spent. But if you withdraw or withhold your allegiance, you refuse to pay taxes, then that question doesn't trouble you over much. Yeah. Right? Yeah. You can kind of pull the plug on that kind of worry at night. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, if you gave money to a mobster and you think, well, what's he doing with that money now? Maybe he's killing somebody, right? Or maybe he's running somebody over with his car, or, dangling somebody off a building. Maybe you might feel bad, right, if you support organized crime. I think that, that's kind of the state writ large in the case of a state that supports slavery. For Thoreau, right, we should be keeping ourselves up at night wondering where our dollars are being spent, what unjust causes are being furthered with our money. But we can save ourselves that worry if we just extract ourselves from the equation. Yeah. And I've always thought that was kind of a novel way of resisting by refusing to pay taxes. I don't think it's one that's been employed, as far as I know, too much. Well, I think it's easier to detect in the modern state than it was at Thoreau's time. Imagine, days of horses and buggies, days of abacuses, right? Days of records on file cards. It's going to take a bit longer to detect your non-payment of taxes, I would assume, and to get around to enforcing violations. Whereas now, just there'll be an alarm or alert set in your file, and you'll get some email notifications, and eventually some tax agent will come and get you, supposedly.
Yeah. They still haven't got me.
No. Well, yeah, I got to make money to owe money.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's a dubious kind of boast.
Well, try as I might. Yeah, I guess maybe like one possible objection I had to this is, again, I guess the case for him where you have a government that is benefiting from slavery directly, it's a bit easier to argue for, but every government has immoral aspects to it, or areas in which it's doing bad things, but the government is such a large amorphous entity that has so many different sections to it, like by not supporting it in one sense, like you're also not supporting like schools or road building, all these other things. So I guess nowadays with our bigger and more bloated governments, it might be the lines might be a bit more blurry, I guess.
Right. It's important to also realize that Thoreau is writing about the problem of slavery as a relatively privileged white liberal intellectual. Right. He spends a night in jail and then he's released. Yeah. No harm, no foul, and he can feel pretty smug about it. Yeah. I took a stand. Yeah. My neighbors were too scared, but look at me, I'm Thoreau. I think now maybe it's important to look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? He's writing about, fighting for social justice in the wake of abolished slavery, right? And this sort of like decades-long struggle to achieve meaningful equality after sort of liberation from the plantations. And so I think it's interesting to look at what his perspective is, right? And his form of nonviolent protest is not just, not paying your taxes, but facing racist police officers who would just love to have any excuse to knock your head in with a truncheon or shoot you or whatever else. So this is the question that he asks of people who want to defend civil rights nonviolently. He asks the questions: are you able to accept blows without retaliation? And are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? And jail didn't sound like much of an ordeal from Thoreau's perspective. Yeah. But I'm guessing if you're a black man or woman in the 60s in America, it's an ordeal. Yeah, definitely. And I was even thinking too with Thoreau, I think he spent most of his time by a pond by himself. He didn't have a family or a community that depended on him, right? If you get sent to prison for a long time, I mean, there's other considerations that single men, might not have. And yeah, I think especially the directly violent threats that come against people of color back in the 1960s, it changes things, I think. Well, let's talk then about his 4 steps of nonviolent campaigns, right? So 1 through 4, we'll just run through them quickly. The first step is that facts of injustice need to be collected, right? That seems to be good. So before you protest an injustice, make sure there is an injustice. Yeah. Seems checks out.
Yeah. Step 1.
Yes. You don't want to show up in the wrong place, protesting the wrong thing. Just have egg on your face. Okay. So step 2, negotiation, right? So, you try to, solve the problem through talking to the actors that have been behaving poorly, it's unlikely that at step number 2, the problem is resolved, presumably because people who benefit from injustice are unlikely to want to stop benefiting from injustice and to own up to what they've been doing, and to accept responsibility for the crappy things that they've been up to behind closed curtains. So step 3 is self-purification, right? That's where you sort of talk to yourself and others in the movement and ask yourself those tough questions about whether or not you're willing to non-violently accept violence being done on you, which is a lot to ask. And if you're not willing to answer that in the affirmative, then you should probably not be there. And then there's direct non-violent action as the 4th and final step. And this could include confrontations with the police or the military, right? That protests and marches and maybe sit-ins and whatever else. And all of this is meant to reopen step number 2, which is negotiation, right? So the idea is that you make enough of a scene through your direct action that the bargaining table has to be set again for a more earnest attempt to resolve the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says on page 523, the purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. So yeah, the whole point is to create these tensions that have been bubbling and bring them to the surface so that they can be renegotiated.
And this speaks to your point, about King's condemnation of the white liberal middle-class fellow, saying, "Wait, this is too much trouble right now. Can't we just wait until the nation's in a bit more of a settled place before we solve the problem of civil rights?" The issue with that, right, is that, like I said before, privileged groups do not give up their privileges willingly, right? And according to King, freedom must be demanded by the oppressed because there is no ideal time. So therefore, the exhortation to wait is not a real objection. Yeah,
he says just below that quote, lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. So yeah, I think that just speaks to that point. And he talks about why the difference between nonviolent action and violent action. And on page 528, he says, "The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expressions through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this is normal and healthy discontent. This normal health and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist."
Yeah. So, obviously here he's talking about his theoretical competitors, right? Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and those actors that are more willing to engage in radical acts, including violence, to achieve their political ends. And he's basically advertising himself and his movement as even though it might not be palatable to white moderates, it is the more palatable option than the more extreme alternatives on offer. So I think, despite his claims that this isn't a warning, I think it is. I think he's saying, look, you think I'm trouble. Well, look out for all these other guys. Look out for, there's going to be blood on the streets unless you tolerate these peaceful demonstrations and actually embrace them, engage with them meaningfully.
I mean,
otherwise the violence will spill out. We see it spill out often in America.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he's like, it's the difference between the gangster showing up to your door and saying, "Oh, your legs might get broken," rather than you dancing on top of a building and someone saying your legs might get broken, right? The one's inevitable, the other is a threat. And I think he's just talking about the inevitability of oppression leading to violence, and how this is an alternative if it's taken seriously enough and people are willing to negotiate.
Yeah, the sad thing is that all of the spokespeople, King and X alike, were both assassinated in this era. Both perceived as threats, obviously, to the regime. So this is, it's sad, of course, how this all turned out. I went to the Martin Luther King Jr. Monument in San Francisco last year, and his words are moving. They're beautiful, and at his best, I think he was trying to articulate an America where really, everybody could live together despite an incredibly fractured and troubled shared history. Given the horrific injustices that have been visited on, blacks in America, it's amazing that a Martin Luther King Jr. arises even. Yeah. It's amazing that this was even on the table in the first place. So, reading his words, you can't help but feel how special this generous intellect and instinct are, and how much he really is trying to reach across the table to his target audience. He connects with figures from the Western intellectual tradition, right? He talks about Socrates. He talks about St. Augustine. He talks about Martin Buber, right? He's showing off his erudition, but he's also, trying to say, look, I'm relatable. I'm not against you. I'm aware of your intellectual trajectory, and I'm asking you to become aware of mine. Yeah,
definitely. This was the first time I had read this. I had heard speeches by him before, but I was blown away just by how good of a writer he is, and how powerful each paragraph he wrote was. He has something very powerful to say each time, and I can see how if you're maybe not, I guess I could see how someone reading this in the 1960s, this could be extremely powerful if you're not just bogged down in racism, hopefully.
But us, we can't just celebrate our heroes. We have to try to poke holes in their arguments. We're philosophers, and as sympathetic as we are to King's cause, are there any things about his article, or Thoreau's for that matter, that give you pause? Since we're sort of at that point where we've explained the article, described, let's say, the finer things about them, but haven't actually posed any concrete objections.
I guess maybe one objection, and I'm not sure how strong it is, against Martin Luther, is his saying or implying that nonviolent action is the only road ahead, and kind of disparaging the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, because I do think at a certain point, if violence is being done towards a group or a community, nonviolence is just not a tenable position to undertake, and sometimes violence is needed to fight back if it's past a certain point.
Well, I don't know. Do we remember the Malcolm X's, or do we remember the Martin Luther Kings, right? I mean, do we remember the people that take the sort of low-hanging fruit of violence, or the people that aspire to a more difficult and lofty path? Right. So Gandhi, for instance, right, is another figure in this sort of tradition. Yeah. And never mind all the stuff that's come up about Gandhi recently, but for what it's worth, also incredibly successful in leading his people to independence through largely nonviolent means, right? There is something effective about that. Like it's hard to, I don't know, think about it just from your perspective, psychologically. Can you really get excited to keep hitting someone who refuses to hit back? Yeah. There's something in our natures, I think, most of us that are well calibrated psychologically, at least, that predisposes us to stop feeling hateful impulses when no threat is present, when no harm is expected in return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that, but I do think ideology, especially like the one that was around in America in the 1960s, can really dial down those sympathetic impulses. Like, check off your bingo card, Hitler, right? Or the Nazi Party. They completely dehumanized another group. And I mean, I'm in agreement.
I guess what you're asking is, could you have opposed Hitler effectively with nonviolence, or would he have just, ordered his panzers to crush your bones on the protest lines?
Yeah, exactly.
And it looks like he might have been more disposed to do that than to listen and engage in a program of political reform that he had no intention of pursuing honestly. Yeah,
if a regime is brutal enough. Again, I think I agree with the idea of Martin Luther King more than Malcolm X, but I'm not sure if it's always going to be tenable.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. I think that we're not talking about. We're specifically not discussing organized revolutions or civil wars, or we're kind of touching on what could potentially be interpreted as, if it gets out of hand, acts of terrorism, right? Like, so the Black Panther Party, I think they were considered to be under suspicion of being a terrorist organization in the 60s because they were armed and they were committed to the project of radical and immediate sort of racial justice, which of course, when it's backed up by a gun, that's a different kind of relationship with the government than if it's simply a protest movement, right? Yeah. So I guess I'm a bit. I understand your urge to avail yourself of the tools of violence, but I also worry that you're missing what's special about King in this circumstance. I think the reason that we still marvel at him is that he doesn't submit ever, no matter how angry he gets, and he's got lots of reasons to be angry. He never lays down his principles and descends to that kind of barbarism. And so I do think every once in a while, every once in a few generations, we do need a moral hero like that who shows us a better way at great personal expense. And he laid down his life for this cause. There can't be anything greater that you can put on the line. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, though, to be sympathetic to your point, I also thought that, distancing himself from X in this way is kind of disingenuous in a way, or maybe it's like, gosh, I don't want to get too bogged down in the politics of the era, but he's portraying himself as the safe option, and he knows that he can, sort of get the middle-class white liberal on his side if he downplays the violent dimension of the project of, racial equality, achieving racial equality in America. Does he sell out that part of the social rights movement? Maybe a little.
Yeah, yeah. He did seem principled. Like maybe it was part of the equation, but I do think he really did believe in the nonviolent approach. And like just to be clear, like I don't advocate for violence. This is just something that I've thought about, and I do think generally like. Nonviolent action is the way to not have this sort of tit for tat cycle of violence continuing. I do think it is the better option generally. I'm just not sure if it holds in every case. And if I was to have any pushback with King, I think that would be where it is.
How about Thoreau? Do you have anything to say about Thoreau that's critical? I mean, we sort of touched on his privileged position. Is there anything else you want to say about Thoreau that's critical?
Yeah, just I think this, and again, I could be convinced otherwise pretty easily, but the law is training wheels. I do think there might be something to that.
Something that he refuses to just accept.
Yeah, that the law has no bearing on morality, and yeah, it can't replace morality, or it can't tell us what morality is, but it can give us some tools, or most people who aren't engaging with moral philosophy and stuff like that, to some sort of confines to think about morality.
I think that's a fair point. Like when he says law never made a man a whit more just. Well, it never made him a whit more unjust either, right? In most cases, except the slavery, the laws that support slavery that he's talking about. And I think that most modern states in a condition of good function acknowledge the need for civil and criminal laws to keep things moving forward, right? When people don't behave justly, well, we need the laws as a sort of like something we can fall back on to stop things from, again, resulting in violent conflict, right? The law is supposed to be there to get in between people's blood feuds and business disputes and petty rivalries, right? And to give us guidelines for good conduct in situations where, goodwill is lacking. Yeah. So I think maybe there's something to what you're saying, right? He does dismiss a bit too nonchalantly the good that laws do or can do. And he just focuses on the negative dimension of being trapped in an unjust state, being forced to pay taxes to support an unjust policy. Yeah. That's his one perspective, and he's not looking at the big picture. Yeah. He wants to not pay his tax money, which I relate to. I mean, I get where he's coming from. Yeah. Wants to hang on to that Skrilla. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think we touched upon it, but my other criticism is that the government has many different branches to it. By refusing to pay taxes, you're also refusing to pay taxes to social programs, roads, and other things. Yeah.
I mean, a system that, isn't really discussed here at great length, but that could be a proposal that takes into account his kind of objection would be, if you could sort of like have, a control over where your tax money is spent, which departments get your funding. Right, so you could say there may be some sort of like minimum on each slider, but you might want to max out arts and education if you're people like us, right? And you might want to like maybe put the slider down on military a little bit, probably. And you know that. So there's that would be something that would take into account both Thoreau's preferences. And it would also be a sort of novel addition to, and easy to, through apps, it would be very easy to make this a reality.
Yeah. I'm almost thinking like a role-playing game. When you build your character, you give them the different attributes. That might actually be a cool system.
Right.
If you're listening, Mr. Trudeau.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Trudeau, he needs some new stuff, right? He needs some new material.
Yeah.
This might be just the thing.
Yeah.
To help him out in the next election. So you've got the think tank out here on the West Coast. We got your back.
Yeah.
So you can max out your tax stats any way you like. I think that'd be great. This is, again, completely unrelated to anything we're talking about. There used to be a really cool restaurant in Vancouver that closed down. But when my daughter was here, I took her to go and see what it was about. It was like you rolled for your burger, how like you had like a table of condiments and they gave you a D20.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And you could roll your condiments and you could roll what kind of burger you got. And like you had different kinds of dice. So it was like a D&D shape your burger kind of place. And I don't know. I thought that was kind of...
How did it turn out?
It turned out all right. Yeah. I mean, you can't go wrong if you know, I mean, they don't put items on the menu like, I don't know, rutabaga shavings or something.
Yeah.
Even that might sound pretty, actually, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Put that on there.
You put almost anything on a burger with moderation and have it work out.
My friends and I one time, again, we're getting derailed here, but
that's fine.
Had almost the exact same game, but we would have an alcohol on one die, 6 different alcohols, something to add to it, like on another die, soy sauce, sriracha, and then like a base on the third die, like milk, soda. It was, we got through like 2 rounds and we were like throwing up. It was disgusting. But
there's a game in Tokyo in Shibuya Izakaya. It is called the Koro Koro game, I think. And it's where you throw a dice or a die, a saikoro, and you roll your beverage. They had 2 10-sided dice, and with the combination, you have a table of 100 possible drinks.
Cool.
On their menu.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, $10 a pop. And some of the results are like a $2 mixed drink you can get from a vending machine if you roll poorly, or like there's sakes that are like $100 bottle of sake or that kind of thing. So you can really spike the roll and get lucky and try really rare liquors, or you can have like a real sort of like street wino experience if you bum out, and everything in between. So that was, I remember that was fun when I was living there. It's a little bit of pep in your step. This has nothing to do with King.
No.
Nor Thoreau.
No.
Although I always feel like if and this is hard to find when you're talking about resisting the government, but I always find it easier to relate to philosophical figures if there's a bit of wit or humor in them. Like earnest prose goes some distance to winning my heart and mind, but if they can also have fun while they're doing it, like Nietzsche. He's having fun. Maybe it's not the cleanest, clearest philosophical position of all time, but God damn it, he's having fun. He's snickering and sniggering and giggling and chuckling and chortling. When he put the pen on the paper, he's just like
going for the digs.
So I guess like that kind of thing, the joie de vivre. I feel like maybe from this perspective, like King is earnest and serious, and he has to be because the cause is so important.
Yeah.
There's no time for a larf.
Yeah.
And with Thoreau, I feel like he's just a bit wooden.
Yeah.
And a bit like
crotchety old man.
Crotchety, that's the word.
Grow your own carrots and leave the government behind.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think that's maybe the reason that we're resorting to humor is because they're patently absent from both of these articles.
Yeah. All right. Well, anything else, Chris?
No, Zan, I think that I'm ready now to, start thinking about taxes a little differently. I think that Thoreau's got me thinking.
Yeah. Well, I legitimately like the dice roll idea, or not dice roll, but the stat idea.
Yeah.
I think that's cool.
All right. Well, let's hope that this is heard and picked up by the right people.
Yeah, let's hope so.
And our ever-growing fan base, because it can't shrink.
Nope.
That's the good news. It's all up from here.
It would be surprising. It would be very surprising.
All right. Well, let's meet again next week and roll this ball a little further forward.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Zan.